Hello everyone and welcome back to the Winning Agenda's Hero Spotlight series for Flesh and Blood. My name's Jesse Marshall. I'm very excited to be back here with Kano, the Dracai of Aether. One of the more maligned heroes in Flesh and Blood in a competitive sense, but certainly a very beloved fan favourite. Not too dissimilar to Azalea, who we previously did a Hero Spotlight on. Kano certainly has its devotees, and what we're going to do today is take you through how to get the most out of Kano decks. And as you'll see as we go through, there is certainly something to be said for if your metagame's not expecting Kano and they're not well prepared for it, because you are attacking on a slightly different axis to every other hero in the game. You can sometimes find an opening in the metagame, despite the inherent drawbacks in the hero, which we'll also come to. But personally, I've been playing quite a bit of Kano recently just to prepare for this video and test out some of the ins and outs, and I've really enjoyed it, so I hope you do too. So the first thing to talk about, which is probably more important than most heroes actually, is the hero card and the ability itself. So Kano's ability is an instant, but it's not a once per turn instant. So you can use this as many times as you can afford in a turn. And because it's an instant, you can use it on your turn or your opponent's turn, crucially. Cost 3, and it says, look at the top card of your deck. If it's a non-attack action card, you may banish it. If you do, you may play it this turn as though it were an instant. So what this means is if you fill your deck with 100% or close to 100% non-attack action cards, you can pay 3 resources at any time, so pitch a blue. You get to look at the top card, banish it, and you can play it at instant speed. So if you do that on your opponent's turn, after they've used all their cards when they have no resources, even if they have arcane barrier equipment, if they haven't got any resources floating or they haven't held back any cards, they can't afford to pay for that arcane barrier. And what this means is that you can turn any of your non-attack actions in your deck into instants by paying 3 more for them. So not only do you have to pay 3 more for them though, you've also got this limitation in that it must be the top card of your deck. So obviously you can immediately see from reading the hero ability that anything that lets you manipulate the top card of your deck, like Opt, is going to be very important, or at least give you information about what's on top of your deck, so you know whether it's worth spending a blue in order just to be able to gain the ability to play that top card. But also anything that gives you additional resources is going to be really useful because this ability is obviously quite resource hungry. And there is an inherent tension in playing a lot of blues in your deck to be able to use Kano's ability off one card, but also wanting powerful hits off the top of your deck. And that's where the Opt and the top of the deck manipulation becomes really important. So you can maximize the chance throughout the game that if you do use Kano's ability, you're going to hit a red or a power card rather than just hitting a blue, which has a more negligible effect. So the weapon that Kano often plays, there are a couple of options, but Crucible of Aetherweave is the popular one, if you like, and I think the most powerful option. It's a once per turn instant, but crucially you can use that once on your opponent's turn and once on your turn. It says the next card you play with an effect that deals arcane damage instead deals that much arcane damage +1. And this concept of damage amplification and increasing the power of your spells is something that is really common in Kano as well. And we've got a whole section of this video devoted just to talking about damage amplification and how it can lead to strong combos on either your turn or your opponent's turn, where you're stringing together multiple pieces of damage amplification to try and have one really big turn and try and burn them out. So the big finish is one of the things to talk about and the things that enable that. And one key piece is Kano's legendary legs. So this legendary leg equipment, it's called Storm Striders, and it has an instant ability as well. It costs 1 resource. Destroy your Storm Striders. You may play your next wizard non-attack action card this turn as though it were an instant. So you can see here we're getting lots of really similar mechanics. The ability to play at instant speed, the ability to amplify damage, and in Blazing Aether, which we'll come to in a moment, the ability to reflect how much damage you've already dealt in the turn to play a more powerful spell. But what Storm Striders does differently to Kano's hero ability is that rather than needing to go off the top with what may seemingly be a random card, albeit you can manipulate it with Opt, etc., you can use Storm Strider's ability to actually play a card from your hand or from your arsenal, which is really important because it means you can set up a bit better into your Storm Strider's turns and into that big finish than you can just having to pay an extra 3 to get things off the top. Because whilst you can Opt things to the top and set up a Kano turn where you're Kanoing a couple of times and you know what's there, you're still having to pay this tax of 3 resources every time you want to access those cards. And that's obviously in addition to the cost of those cards themselves if they have a resource cost. Whereas with Stormstriders, you're only having this one resource tax to be able to play something on their turn. And you get to choose what it is because it's in your hand or in your arsenal. So that can enable you to, in combination with Kano's ability, and perhaps opting as well, or tutoring things and putting them top of your deck, can allow you to set up a really big turn with sort of a couple of resource discount compared to Kanoing, which can be just enough to allow you to string together a couple of extra pieces into that big turn that can lead to a significant increase in damage. And the way that we get that significant increase in damage is through cards like Blazing Aether, which, as you can see, it costs 0. It's the Kano specialization. It's a wizard action. It says deal X damage to target hero, where X is the amount of arcane damage you've dealt to that hero this turn. So you can see there that when you're using things like Crucible of Aetherweave, which amplifies damage by 1, the weapon, earlier in the turn, if you manage to deal some damage with that first spell, and then later in the turn you play Blazing Aether, not only have you got the Crucible of Aetherweave bonus on that first spell that you played, but you've also then carried that through as damage that's already been dealt in the turn, that's then amplifying the Blazing Aether's power as well. And there are a range of other cards which we'll come to later in the video that give you that opportunity either to amplify the damage on the first spell, which then makes your Blazing Aether as your last play even stronger, or amplify the damage of the first and then amplify the subsequent spell, things like Aether Flare, which we'll come to, that allow you to not only, obviously you can amplify them themselves and make them stronger, but then the amount of damage that they deal is reflected in the next spell, which you can then chain into a Blazing Aether later. So damage buffs are one really important piece of the puzzle, not just Crucible of Aetherweave, which is one option, but these other ways that you can increase the power of the next arcane damage dealer that you play. So Tome of Aetherwind is a really versatile, interesting wizard action. It's one that you love to see off the top when you're Kano, because it's really flexible. So it gives you this option, if you do see it off the top and play it as an instant with Kano, you can either draw 2 cards, which is very strong, because you can obviously replace the blue that you spent to Kano by drawing into a blue, and then draw into another card as well. So you're a net profit there in terms of card advantage. Or you can, if you see it off the top and you want to Kano it, you can also use it to amplify damage, not just draw extra cards. And that might be the path that you want to go down, because perhaps you've got lots of other resources left in hand, or you've got some key plays that you're going to make, and having that extra 1 or 2, because remember the card says choose 2, so you can choose damage amplification twice. So perhaps amplifying your next play by 2 extra arcane damage will lead throughout the rest of your turn to a significant amount of extra damage, and that might be where you want to go. But more regularly, you'll see this played for the draw a card mode, because obviously that's very powerful when every blue that you draw is another potential play with Kano, and other cards that you draw can also be strong as well if you're on your Stormstrider's turn and you really want to get a particular card in your hand, which you know is towards the top of your deck. So Crucible of Aetherweave, we've already mentioned, is one way that you can amplify damage as well. This is bread and butter. Every spare resource you have on your turns, you can turn into an extra damage, which is strong, particularly once you're able to chain attacks together, or damage spells rather together. Metacarpus Node is basically the same as Crucible of Aetherweave without the once per turn restriction, but it's one use only, basically. One turn use only. So this is where, in combination with that Stormstrider's ability to play at instant speed, something from your hand or from your arsenal, if you can have enough resources on that big turn to also be Metacarpus noding every single one of your damage spells, if you can try and chain together 2, 3, even 4 on that big turn, if you've got 4 extra resources for those 4 spells, on each one of them, you can add an extra damage, which, as we saw with Blazing Aether, if you're adding 1 to each of them, not only do you get the damage as you play each of them, but then you get all 4 of that extra damage again in the Blazing Aether. So that's how it can become, the amount of damage you deal on these big turns can grow quite quickly, and Metacarpus Node can allow you to do that. Now, it is very resource intensive. Having an extra resource for every one of your attacks sometimes doesn't happen. And sometimes with those extra resources, you're better served Kanoing again later in the turn to maybe hit a whole nother Blazing Aether, which you are able to put on top, or which you know is on top. But sometimes using all your resources, or your spare resources for Metacarpus Node is going to be the best way to give yourself the best chance of winning. Cindering Foresight is an innocuous looking card at first, but it fuels some very powerful Kano play patterns. And because knowing the top card of your deck on your opponent's turn is such an important thing, if you do want to be doing that playing at the end of their turn play pattern, which we'll discuss later, it's not always what you want to do. Sometimes you just want to play on your turn, even if they have Arcane Barrier, to strip cards out of their hand. But what Cindering Foresight does is it gives you the opportunity to race at the end of their turn and to play at the end of their turn with a little more control than you otherwise would. So you can play Cindering Foresight red as an instant if it's their turn. Then you get to opt 3, which is quite a lot when you can know what the top 3 cards are, or perhaps, reorder some of them and put them on the bottom if you want to. Then the next card you play this turn with an effect that deals arcane damage deals that much +1. So you get this little damage amplification for 0 resources. Obviously you're spending a card. And you get to opt for 3, which is quite a lot because you can dig for something. You can dig for a red, dig for a good play, as well as giving it a slight buff and amplification, which can just help to avoid the situation where you do the dreaded, block with 2 cards, hold up 2 cards. Then at the end of their turn, you think, I want to try and do a bit of damage and get a bit of chip damage in, and you pitch a blue and you hit a blue, which does 1 damage or something, and you just think, oh, that was such a miserable waste of a turn. Cindering Foresight helps you avoid that by being, you go Cindering Foresight, it buffs your next play, lets you dig for a red, put the red on top, then you Kano and play the red for a little bit more damage, perhaps 5 or 6. Aether Flare, which we just skipped over there. So Aether Flare is a really important one in these combo turns. It only costs 1. It deals 3 arcane damage, so 1 for 3. As you'll see when we come to the vanilla spells, is a little bit below rate. But what it does do is the next card you play this turn with an effect that deals arcane damage instead deals that much arcane damage plus X, where X is the amount dealt by Aether Flare. So if you buff your Aether Flare to be, say, 6, 7 power, then the Aether Flare is threatening to buff your next play by 6 or 7 as well. So if you can chain a 6 or 7 strength Aether Flare into another 3 or 4 damage spell, that then gets up towards 10 damage, and then in total you've dealt sort of 16, 17 damage in the turn, and then you can add a Blazing Aether on top of that for 0 resources, which is going to deal 16 or 17 extra, double the damage you've already dealt. So obviously these big turns where you're finishing with the Blazing Aether, the higher the damage you deal before the Blazing Aether, significantly higher the overall damage you're going to deal in the turn. Stir the Aether Winds is the other one that combos not only with Aether Flare. Obviously, if you go Stir the Aether Winds, then Aether Flare, you've got +3 to the Aether Flare, but then that carries through to the next spell as well because the Aether Flare buffs by +X, where X is the amount that it deals. Stir the Aether Winds, though, combos very well with everything else in the deck. So it's kind of it's a key combo piece that also enables you, if you hit it off Kano, to play something out of your hand as an instant. Or if you have it in Arsenal, it allows you to make some sort of bigger plays on your turn, sometimes off only 2 or 3 cards in hand, which is a key part of how your deck can, or how these Kano decks can keep up in the damage race. So what it does is it costs 2. It's a wizard non-attack action. It says you may play your next wizard non-attack action this turn rather, as though it were an instant, and if it has an effect that deals arcane damage, instead that effect deals that much arcane damage +3. So this buffs by 3. It doesn't cost an action point, I guess, or rather it's action point neutral. You need one to play it if you're playing it as an action, but then you get to play your next non-attack action as though it were an instant. So you can play this plus a damage spell on the same turn if it's just one of your regular turns. As I said, if you hit this off Kano, you can play this as an instant because you've banished it with Kano. Then you can play something from your hand as an instant because this gives you the ability to do that after you've played it. So that can be quite a strong play at the end of their turn as well. But that buff by 3 as well is just enough to make particularly Aether Flare really dangerous, because then you're threatening something even bigger afterwards, as well as Forked Lightning, which is one of the other cards we'll come to, because Forked Lightning has 2 separate instances of damage on it, but for the purposes of Arcane Barrier, it counts as one source of damage. Stir the Aether Winds actually buffs each of the 2 separate instances on the card by 3, which is quite a lot. So you're getting +6, really, if you chain this into a Forked Lightning. So damage dealers. Now we're coming to the kind of bread and butter of how you're going to trade damage throughout the game. We've already covered off on a couple of them, like Aether Flare, but these are kind of the bread and butter options that you've got for your vanilla damage cards. And they also help you to evaluate the remainder of the cards in the Kano card pool in terms of how much you're giving up in terms of basic arcane damage in order to get the ability on the card. Because a lot of the other arcane damage dealers in the card pool have an arcane damage amount on them plus another ability, whereas these vanilla ones are just the exact rate that you get for pure arcane damage dealers. So for 0 resources at red, you get 3 arcane damage and a block for 3. For 1 resource at red, you get 4 arcane damage and a block for 3. And for 2 resources at red, you get 5 arcane damage and a block for 3. So you can see you go from 3 to 4 to 5 by paying 1 extra resource each time. At 3 cost, you get Forked Lightning, which is a super rare, not part of the same cycle if you like, but it's still illustrative in terms of what rate you can get for the additional resource. And for 3 resources, you get 2 instances of 2 arcane damage. And you can see in the reminder text there, as I said a moment ago, if you've got an effect that modifies the amount of arcane damage that Forked Lightning deals, it modifies both. So even as something as simple as using your weapon, your Crucible, buffing Forked Lightning by 1 will actually buff by 2 in total, because you'll get deal 3, then deal 3, as opposed to deal 2, then deal 2. But if you play Stir the Aetherwinds and buff each of those by 3, then it's deal 5, then deal 5. So you've actually got a 6 damage buff from your Stir the Aetherwinds. So that's a nice little combo. Forked Lightning does cost 3, which is a whole nother blue. So if you were to have a Forked Lightning on top of your deck, pitch for 3 to Kano it, then pitch for 3 to play it, that's 2 blues out of your hand just to play the Forked Lightning. Then if you want to pay for a activation of your Crucible plus a Stir the Aetherwinds, that's another 3 resources. So you have to have the Stir, either in Arsenal in your hand, and then you have to have the blue to pay for the Stir and the Crucible, which is another 3 resources. So all in all, whether Forked is either in your hand or on top of your deck, it's either Forked or the card to Kano it, the blue to Kano it, the blue to play it to pay the resource cost, the blue to pay the resource cost of the Stir the Aetherwinds, and then the Stir the Aetherwinds itself. So 4 cards, which you either need in hand or in arsenal to pull off one of those reasonably large turns. But if you do that, then you're getting 12 damage. 6 and 6 from the 2 instances, and they're all coming from 1 card. So even if they have Arcane Barrier 2 or 3, they're only going to be able to prevent 2 or 3 out of the 12. So Stir into Forked Lightning with a Crucible activation, if you can afford it, is one of the ways that, without even any shenanigans, because your Stir gives you the ability to play the Forked Lightning at instant speed if you play the Stir with your action point on your turn. So no shenanigans required, no Kanos necessarily required. You can be dishing out 12 damage. So that's one of the ways that you can chip in reasonably significant damage or threaten to finish the game, even through quite a lot of Arcane Barrier. Action enablers. So this is the other way, other than Kano itself, which can obviously give you these additional action points effectively, by giving you the ability to play your non-attack actions as instants on their turn, or on your turn. But the cost is quite steep. Kano is costing you 3 resources every time you do that, which is basically another card just to get that extra action point, or the extra ability to play something, and you don't know what it is. Whereas things like Sonic Boom and the other cards on this screen here, which we'll come to in a minute, give you what is in effect an extra action point or an extra play in a slightly different way to what Kano does. So Sonic Boom is probably the most similar to Kano, actually. It costs 2, it deals 3 arcane damage. If it deals damage, you look at the top card of your deck. If it's a wizard non-attack action card, that's important, it can't be generic. You may banish it, whereas Kano can play generic, Sonic Boom can't. If it's a wizard non-attack action card, you may banish it. If you do, you may play it this turn as though it were an instant, and it costs X resource points less to play, where X is the damage dealt by Sonic Boom. So if you compare playing Sonic Boom to using Kano's ability, Sonic Boom costs an action point in and of itself to play if you do it on your turn. Obviously, if you've already Kano'd to get it, then it doesn't cost an action point, but putting that aside. So it costs you an action point, whereas Kano's ability is an instant. It can only hit wizard non-attack action cards rather than all non-attack action cards, because Kano can hit potions and other things, which are not wizard cards. But Sonic Boom gives you this resource discount, which is really important, because that, with a lot of cards, even with a Forked Lightning, which is a whole nother blue just to play the resource cost for Forked Lightning, Sonic Boom gets around that. So you've got slightly more restrictive, it costs you that action point up front, it only hits wizard cards, but this resource cost discount is very, very important for enabling bigger turns. So Sonic Boom can be an important way to shortcut some of the resource intensive big turn plays that you want to try and put together. But again, you do have to know what's on top of your deck. So those opt cards are going to be really important for setting up your good Sonic Booms. Chain Lightning is another one that gets you an additional action, but Chain Lightning is really challenging to make work. It's excellent if you hit it off the top with Kano, but it's really bad if you draw it. I mean, it still blocks for 3, but in terms of enabling big turns, it doesn't do it much if you got it in your hand. So it says you may play your next wizard non-attack action card this turn as though it were an instant. If you have played another wizard non-attack action card this turn, deal 3 arcane damage to each opposing hero. Important for multiplayer, it deals it to each opposing hero, like some other cards in Crucible of War that affect all players. But as far as 1v1 goes, if you have this in your hand, it takes your action point to play it, so the fact that you can play your next wizard non-attack action card as an instant, kind of much of a muchness. If you've played another wizard non-attack action card this turn though, you get to deal 3 arcane damage. So this becomes a 1 for 3, as long as you played something else that turn. It becomes a 1 for 3 that then enables you to play another card from your hand. So that's okay, but in order for you to be able to play this from your hand, or from your arsenal, you have to either have an action point available, in which case you could have already played that other card from your hand with that action point. And if you hit this off the top, then it can net you an action point. But it still costs you the 3 resources to Kano it, plus it has to be on top of your deck and you have to not have drawn it. And then it costs you 1 resource to play, which is then a part of another card. I think if Chain Lightning costs 0, it would be very good. At the moment, it's okay. Like, I don't always, particularly in Classic Constructed, I'm not sure I'd always play this, but certainly in Blitz, and if you do have enough opt, and if you high roll, like if you do really well, in terms of how they're ordered and whether you hit them off the top or whether you draw them, if they are always on top of your deck, they're great. I'll put it that way. And they can enable some really big plays. So Chain Lightning is an interesting one. Not as much raw power, I guess, as Sonic Boom, but it can enable some interesting plays, particularly in combination with Snapback, which we'll come to in a minute. Reverberate is a 1 for 3. So again, you compare that to Scalding Rain, which is the vanilla, and you're losing 1 damage here. I should have said for Sonic Boom as well. You know, you compare Sonic Boom at yellow to Yellow Voltic Bolt, which is the vanilla cost 2, and you're losing 1 arcane damage. But you're losing 1 arcane damage to gain basically a free additional spell most of the time, which is very strong. Always happy to pay that trade. With Reverberate, it's a little bit different. So you get the ability, if you deal damage with Reverberate, you can banish a wizard non-attack from your hand, but its total cost has to be less than or equal to the damage dealt by Reverberate. So it's a bit more restrictive than Sonic Boom, because Sonic Boom gives you a discount. Lets you banish the card off the top, and you play it at a discount. It doesn't restrict the resource cost of the card you banish from the top, whereas Reverberate says you can only banish a card from your hand with Reverberate's ability if it hits, if the total cost of that card is less than or equal to the damage dealt by Reverberate. If you do banish a card from your hand, you can play it this turn as though it were an instant. So Sonic Boom gets you access to an extra card at the top of your deck, wizard non-attack action, which you can play at a discount. Cool. Reverberate gives you access to play another card, another wizard, again, wizard non-attack action card from your hand, but it has to have resource cost less than the amount of damage that Reverberate dealt, and you don't get a discount. So there are some situations where Reverberate is more useful because you've got a particular card in your hand, like Blazing Aether. Its resource cost 0, so as long as Reverberate does 1 damage, you get to banish the Blazing Aether, you can play it as an instant, and you don't care about the resource cost discount because Blazing Aether costs 0 anyway. Reverberate's great in that instance for letting you play your Blazing Aethers that you've got in hand. Sonic Boom, though, can let you play a Blazing Aether off the top as long as you can get it there, but also gives you that resource point discount, which can be really important because sometimes, if you're blocking a lot or if you're in a trade, you just don't have cards left in hand to banish with Reverberate, whereas Sonic Boom always has a target because you've always got a card on top of your deck. So that's kind of the difference between the two cards. They can both be really powerful. They can both enable big plays, but Sonic Boom, given that you're wanting naturally to opt anyway, can have that extra bit of versatility and reach and basically card advantage. And then Stir the Aetherwinds, which I've mentioned already, does give you that action point effectively by being action point neutral and giving you the buff. Snapback, which I mentioned a moment ago, combos pretty well with Chain Lightning, because as long as you've played another Wizard non-attack action card this turn, you can play it as though it was an instant. And what that means is you can play Chain Lightning with your action point. You can play the Snapback in response, because you've now met Snapback's condition before the Chain Lightning resolves. You play the Snapback, you deal 3 damage. Then the Chain Lightning, which we'll go back to... can't go back to it very easily. But anyway, Chain Lightning says if you've played another non-attack action card this turn, then it deals 3 damage. So because you've now played the Snapback whilst the Chain Lightning was on the stack, when the Chain Lightning resolves, it then deals the 3 damage, and then you get to play something else as though it's an instant as well. So Chain Lightning and Snapback do have a nice synergy, but they aren't the most powerful in terms of damage dealt. So they're both 1 for 3s, which is one below the vanilla. You know, Scalding Rain at red is a 1 for 4. I guess Chain Lightning's yellow, so perhaps it is on rate in that sense. But the 3 damage is conditional. So there is synergy there. There is a bit of power, given that if you hit the Chain Lightning off the top with Kano, then you play the Snapback from your hand, you've still got an action point. Or rather, the ability to play something as though it was an instant, even on your opponent's turn. But the fact that they are a bit below rate and they're a bit conditional, it's something to be careful of. So resources is next, and as I mentioned, Kano's ability and the fact that it requires 3 to get that extra action point and play off the top does get quite resource intensive when you're stacking up these big turns. You've got Kano's ability soaking up resources, you've got Metacarpus Node on your big turn, you've got the 1 to activate Storm Striders, you've got the 1 to activate Crucible hopefully at one time during that turn, and then you've got the resource cost to actually play all these cards. Energy potions help you to get there, and they synergize really well with Kano, because in those earlier turns, you can either just play an energy potion from your hand, fine, then you draw up and you can do some stuff on their turn, or you can hit it off the top with Kano's ability and just play it out for 0, which is also fine. Like, you never feel really bad hitting an energy potion, because you always have the resources to play it because it costs 0, and playing it as an instant is really nice. You've effectively turned a blue in your hand, which may not have been doing all that much on that particular turn, into a yellow later on a turn when you're trying to amass a really big amount of damage. So Energy Potion synergizes really, really well with Kano. Tome of Fyendel is a 1-cost action. Well known to most people. It's a generic from the first set. It says draw 2 cards, and if it's played from Arsenal, you gain a life for each card in your hand. Now, obviously, if you're Kano and you don't really mind all that much about the action point on your turn, then drawing up with Tome of Fyendel can let you then, play some other stuff at instant speed with Kano's ability. That's cool. But sometimes you really do care about the card in your hand, so you do need to be careful about Tome of Fyendel, because playing it from Arsenal, obviously you can't Kano it from Arsenal. So you are generally going to be needing to spend your action point doing it. Obviously, the way you can get around that is through things like Chain Lightning, which give you that ability to play something else. And that's where, Chain Lightning and Tome do have a bit more synergy. But yeah, in all other instances, when you're playing the Tome of Fyendel using your action point for the turn, you're giving up on the opportunity to just chip in with a damage spell on that turn. And that is worth being aware of. On the flip side, though, playing a Tome from your arsenal, particularly using a Tunic resource, so you're not needing to pitch for it, means that you're going to be gaining 6 life. And gaining 6 life and setting yourself up for a reasonably big turn, that's something to sneeze at. Particularly if you can opt before that. Perhaps you've Cindering Foresighted on their previous turn. You've seen a couple of blues on top. Then on your turn, you use your Tunic resource, Tome of Fyendel, draw up to 5 because you spent 1 card on the Cindering Foresight. Gain 5 life, and you've got a few blues in hand, so you can try and do some Kano stuff on that turn. Yeah, maybe that's good. Maybe you've, that you've got a particular combo on top where you can do something good with at instant speed on your turn, and you don't care too much about losing your action point, and Tome gets stronger. But I guess what I'm saying is, whilst there are some ways that you can make use of those extra cards on your turn, do be aware that it's not a free roll. Like the fact that Kano doesn't need to do things using the action point on your turn doesn't mean you don't want to, because it's still more efficient to use that action point on your turn every turn, either getting some damage in or drawing cards out of their hand, getting them to commit cards to defending with Arcane Barrier. And if you take a turn off to Tome of Findle, you are still using an action point, which is a resource in the game for you. So do think about that, but Tome definitely very powerful in Kano for sure. And obviously you can hit it off the top with Kano. You can Kano, spend 1 resource to play the Tome, and then you're drawing 2 cards. And if you draw 2 blues, you're still up 2 resources at that point. So certainly not a bad one to hit off the top with Kano. Tome of Aetherwind, similarly, as I mentioned earlier, if you pitch a blue to Kano, you see Tome of Aetherwind on top, you can draw 2 cards with it, and if one of them's blue, then you're up on resources. And you've played an action this turn, which means that things like your Chain Lightning is turned on, and Gaze the Ages is turned on, which we'll come to later. So always happy to see Tome of Aetherwind off the top with Kano. So now we come to the opting and deck fixing part of it. You've seen how important it can be to chain together the right spells and use your damage amplifiers with your spells that either further amplify damage, or your Fork Lightnings, which are kind of your big finishers, or your bigger damage spells even. But how do you make your deck the most resource efficient, I guess? How do you minimize the number of times when you pitch a card to Kano's ability and hit a blue, which is just terrible, and you just lose all this tempo and waste all these resources? Well, you use opt cards. Aether is obviously a fabled, it's a bit expensive. You don't need it for the deck by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a really good opportunity to just pitch as a blue to Kano's ability, resolve an opt to, and then you get the choice of what card you're going to hit from Kano. All those turns feel great. There is, though, an opportunity cost to Eye. Again, it's not a free roll. None of these powerful cards are necessarily a free roll or better than the other options in this deck. So Eye is a miss on Kano, right? It's not a non-attack action. So if Eye is on top of your deck and you pitch to Kano blindly and you hit the Eye, it feels terrible. You've just wasted 3 resources, 1 card in the bin. So you do need to be careful of that. And for that reason, you don't necessarily want to play Eye. But if you construct your deck so you're using Kano's ability more sparingly, or you have more control over what's on top of your deck by opting more frequently, then I can contribute to that kind of game plan. And I think that is the better way to construct your game plan with Kano. Fate Foreseen is another one. Like Cindering Foresight, it allows you to opt on your opponent's turn, which can be extremely strong because opting on your turn is one thing, but you're often going to try and use the cards from your hand and draw up at the end of your turn, and then you have the opportunity to play on their turn. So if you have a Fate Foreseen in hand, you can defend and set up better plays at the end of their turn if you want them, just by having this little opt one. Now that opt one is not necessarily going to fix your deck for you and mean that your plays are 100% secure and perfect, but it does let you know that key top card of your deck. And for instance, if it is the Aether, it lets you put it on the bottom and stop you wasting those 3 resources. Or it just gives you some intel about whether it is a blue or a red, and whether you want to try and go off at the end of their turn, or perhaps whether you want to just play your cards more conservatively, even block a little bit more, or use an action point on your turn and then arsenal, rather than going for some kind of Kano chain at the end of their turn. Cindering Foresight, similarly, as I mentioned before, if, for instance, you Cindering Foresight, you find a Stir the Aetherwinds on top, well, that can be nice. You Stir the Aetherwinds, and then you've got something else in hand which you can play with the Stir. You can go Cindering Foresight. I've got a +1 buff sitting there. I'll play that Stir off the top, and then I'll play this damage dealer. And that's all happening at the end of your turn, and it's all reasonably efficient, well contained. I've got all the info I need. So Cindering Foresight works very well for setting up that playstyle I was describing earlier, where you're not Kanoing blind as much, and you're trying to control when and where you hit Kano's ability to hit that top card. Gaze the Ages as well, a great one to hit off the top. Great after you've played a Tome of Aetherwind off the top. Then you Kano again, you hit a Gaze the Ages. Gaze the Ages gets banished, you can play it, opt to, and then because you've played a Tome of Aetherwind already, which is a wizard non-attack action, Gaze the Ages goes back into your hand. So the 3 resources you spent Kanoing to find the Gaze get refunded because the Gaze goes back to your hand, and you've opted to as well. So you've got that little opt bonus, which becomes the free roll part of the card. It's also totally fine to draw Gaze. It blocks for 3. It takes an action point to play from your hand, so you're generally not going to be playing it from your hand, but you're happy to pitch it to Kano's ability or to pay for spells or whatever else. So Gaze, certainly one of the better cards and more powerful cards in the deck, and a really important piece of keeping the deck efficient. Talismanic Lens is a piece of equipment. It's always on the board. And on one key turn, when you really want to know the top 2 cards, because it's crucial that you don't miss, or it's crucial that you hit a particular type of card off the top, Talismanic Lens can help you get there. It's far and away the best piece of headgear, I think, for Kano most of the time. Obviously, a skull cap can be the difference between winning and losing against a Katsu, blocking one of those extra Kodachi hits or a couple of extra Kodachi hits. But Talismanic Lens does improve the consistency of your game plan. So if you can afford that slot, I definitely consider rocking Talismanic Lens as your headpiece. Lesson in Lava is the other Kano specialization, which not only gets them for 3, which is 1 worse than Scalding Rain, but it's actually on rate for a yellow. So whilst you probably wouldn't play yellow Scalding Rain, this isn't so bad. So let's say that it's on rate for an arcane damage dealer. But it gives you this really powerful additional ability, which when it deals damage, you can search your deck for a wizard card with resource cost equal to or less than the damage dealt by Lesson in Lava, reveal it, shuffle your deck, and put it on top of your deck. And this enables you to do things like tutor up an Aether Flare, tutor up a Stir the Aetherwinds, tutor up a Blazing Aether as a finisher. Any of those things can be really strong to follow on from the Lesson in Lava. And obviously putting them on top of your deck, not as good as putting them in your hand, but on those key turns when you've got the resources, you've got a couple of energy potions in play, you're planning to play off the top with Kano, putting them on top, it can actually be better because they're not taking an action point from there. So Lesson in Lava in Arsenal can be, a really strong way to start a big turn, even if you're going to do it on your turn. It doesn't necessarily have to be your killing turn, but it means that you're threatening some damage with a lot more control over what it is that you're actually threatening rather than having to go Kanoing blind. So all of these cards on this image here are showing different ways that you can manage and mitigate the need to Kano blind, because Kanoing blindly is always a huge risk because you're throwing away a card, you're throwing away resources that's a lot of the time going to be 3 life effectively that you could have blocked or prevented the damage or whatever else. And throwing that away blindly without any control over it is not a way to consistently win matches. So using all of these cards here to mitigate your need to do that can help you to be more consistent and win more games with Kano. Aether Spindle is the last one. It's a 2 cost for 4 damage, so slightly below rate. Voltic Bolt Red is 2 for 5, the vanilla damage dealer. But Aether Spindle says opt X, where X is the amount of damage dealt by Aether Spindle. So that can be really good on their turn, though. It is a bit expensive. You're paying 3 to Kano it, and then you're paying 2 for the Aether Spindle. That's most of 2 cards. Maybe you have a resource left if you pitch 2 blues at that point. And then you are opting X, so that's very powerful. So if you had a hand of 4 blues, you pitch one of them, say it's an Ivor Fidia, opt 2, you put an Aether Spindle on top, you banish the Aether Spindle, then you pitch another blue, play the Aether Spindle as an instant, you got 1 resource floating and you still got 2 cards in hand, and maybe use that 1 resource for your Crucible to buff it to 5. So you got no resources floating, you got 2 cards in hand, and you're opting 5. Even if they're Arcane Barrier 2, you're opting 3. So you're seeing 3 cards off the top, and then you've got 2, say there are 2 blues left in hand, that you can potentially look to Kano again and play the cards on top. Now, yes, that's expensive, and yes, having to spend 2 cards to Kano and then play the Aether Spindle is quite a lot, but that effect and being able to mitigate and control the need to Kano blindly subsequently just means you have that little bit more control again on those turns on what comes next. So key combos, I've kind of mentioned a few of these as we've gone through. Stir the Aetherwinds is a great starter for any of these combos because it's just your action point on your turn, chuck it in Arsenal. If at any point you end up with a couple of blues left in hand on your turn, you can go pitch, play the Stir the Aetherwinds, pitch, play whatever else. It doesn't cost you any action points. You don't need to do any Kanoing. It just goes off itself and it's action point neutral. So Stir the Aetherwinds into Aether Flare, really great, because then if you Stir the Aetherwinds, Aether Flare, and then you've had some way to opt and you know that there's a big finisher on top, whether it's a Blazing Aether, Forked Lightning, whatever else, then you're really in business. Like if you go Stir the Aether Winds into Aether Flare 6 damage, into pitch to Kano, pitch to play Forked Lightning off the top, you're potentially looking at 16 damage from the Forked Lightning plus the 6 damage from the Aether Flare. Obviously reduced by null runes, but that is still a lot to be threatening. 22 damage is quite a lot. Similarly, if you were to chain that into a Blazing Aether, you're obviously amplifying the damage even more. Lesson in Lava, as I mentioned, can let you combo into any of these things. So it can let you go and find Stir the Aether Winds. It can let you go and find Aether Flare. It can let you go and find Forked Lightning or Blazing Aether even more commonly because Blazing Aether costs 0. And that can just be, that means Lesson in Lava can be a great middle card in these combos, or it can be a great card to start them off with, just because it gives you that tutor and that ability to control when and what you find. Sonic Boom can work really well, particularly if you've had an Aether Spindle earlier or a Cindering Foresight that's let you opt a little bit and control what's on top of your deck. Then you can stir into Aether Flare, into Sonic Boom, into a Blazing Aether, and then you've got a really, really big turn. Forked Lightning, I mentioned as well, similarly powerful. So what you can kind of see here on this slide is you've got Stir the Aether Winds and Aether Flare are your two most powerful amplifiers. Lesson in Lava and Sonic Boom are two ways that you can commonly gain advantage. I haven't got Reverberate there, but Reverberate is another great example of a card that gains you that action point, almost. I mean, Lesson in Lava doesn't quite gain you the action point, but it gains you access to the card, which is really important. Sonic Boom just straight up gains you the action point. Obviously, chaining your damage amplifiers into them is good, but chaining all of them into Forked Lightning is also great because of the double amplification that you get from Forked Lightning. And then finishing with Blazing Aether, which basically says as much damage as you manage to cobble together on the rest of your turn, Blazing Aether will double it. And for the low cost of 0 resources, that's a great finisher to any combo turn. So what equipment do we play? We've already mentioned most of these throughout the video. Talismanic Lens is a headpiece, just gives you that instant speed opt when you want it. Findle Spring Tunic gives you that Tome of Findle without having to spend a card, or all manner of other really, really important resources throughout the game. Even just that extra activation for Crucible of Aetherweave can be really important. Metacarpus Node for that big final turn. Just dump those extra resources into the Metacarpus node and it can help you to get over the top of some key damage thresholds and carry that damage through to your Blazing Aether, which you play at the end. Stormstriders, Kano's world famous legs, just gives you the ability to go off at the end of their turn a little bit more cheaply than you'd need to with Kano and with that bit more control because you're able to play the card from your hand or from Arsenal. If you were going to go for budget options, you could scrap all of that, say, I don't have a Tunic, I don't want one, I don't have Stormstriders, what else can I do? Well, you can still play the deck, absolutely. Talismanic Lens are common, Robe of Rapture is a great replacement for Tunic, destroy it, gain 3 resources. That's a free Kano activation that you can add to a big combo turn. It's a pretty big deal. Iron Rock Gauntlet can just be an extra little block to keep you alive a bit longer. And Mage Master Boots can very much help with a little Tome of Findle combo, or really any of your cards that's giving you, an extra action point for the low cost of 1 resource. So rather than Stormstriders, which allows you to go off on their turn, Mage Master Boots can let you set up, and Robe of Rapture together, can let you set up just a much bigger turn on your turn. Which, there's no saying that that's necessarily going to be worse, particularly if they have low or no arcane barrier, and the ability to do it at the end of their turn is kind of irrelevant anyway. So how do we think about Kano on a macro level? These are kind of the points that I wanted to leave you with at the end of the video. So keep the life total gap low with damage bursts, use your vanilla damage spells, use kind of little efficient damage packages, Stir the Aether Winds Forked or whatever else, to keep the life total gap low. I should have mentioned very early on, of course, Kano starts with 30 life, which is 10 life less than other heroes. So you're already starting at a 10 life disadvantage. You need to keep that life total disadvantage at 10 or lower as much as you can, and then go for your big finish on their turn. And the reason the big finish on their turn can be important is that you can do it in response to their killing blow. They can go crippling crush you for 11, and if you can kill them with your Stormstriders and your damage in response, after they've hopefully spent most of their resources playing the Crippling Crush, then it doesn't really matter that this Crippling Crush is sitting there on the stack. You get to kill them anyway at instant speed. So keep the life total gap low enough that when they do go for that killing blow, you can kill them in response at instant speed with your big finish. Use opt to decide whether to commit resources to those instant speed plays. Try not to Kano blind as much as possible. Try to use your resources efficiently to either block if you don't know what's on top, or to opt and check, and then make the evaluation about whether to commit more resources to blocking or arsenaling, as opposed to just Kanoing blind. And if you do see something good on top, go for it then. Make that decision that that's your time to try and chip in a bit more damage or have a bigger turn. Build your board position with potions. Energy potion, great way to build up those bigger turns. So you've got 2 or 3 sitting there on the board, which can let you play that extra Forked Lightning and then be able to Kano for the Blazing Aether as your finisher. Use combos to get the most out of your cards. It's obviously going to be stronger if you can get Sturdy Aether Winds into Forked Lightning with a Crucible activation than it is just to play Forked Lightning for 4. It's significantly better, and it's going to give you a much better chance of winning to use your more powerful cards in a more powerful mode rather than just kind of using a vanilla version. I mean, Blazing Aethering for 0 is not very good, but Blazing Aethering for 17 or 20 is amazing. And I guess that's where, as a point to finish on, Kano's cards are very different, and card evaluation and thinking about where you're at in the game with Kano is very different to a lot of other heroes, because your cards have such a power differential between what's printed on them and what they can do. The floor and the ceiling for a lot of these cards are miles apart, whereas for a lot of other heroes, the floor and the ceiling of a particular card are very close together because it kind of does what it says on the card. Because so much of Kano relies on this damage amplification and the comboing of cards together, kind of similar to Fuse in a way, if you like, from Tales of Aria. You get a much better mode on the card if you got more resources available and more similar synergistic cards in hand. You do need to think about when you're constructing your deck, trying to have some good turns that don't require 4 or 5 cards in hand and don't require you to have be going big. But also making sure that you have enough tools to enable you to go big when you need to. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've enjoyed this little discussion about Kano, one of the more interesting, different heroes in Flesh and Blood, which can be really rewarding and fun to play, even if perhaps you don't win as much as you would like to, or as much as you might with other heroes. We'll be back with more hero spotlights down the road. We've been through a few now, but it might be time to get started on some of the Aria heroes. I don't know. We'll see how we go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. And we'll be back with more fab content very soon. Cheers.